We now have a fantastic session powered by Wipro with a great lineup of speakers from across the country. And the panel that you'll be hearing from next will be talking on touchless and remote governance with citizen experience at the heart. And I'm now going to hand over to Nitesh Jain, Vice President and Business Head of Travel, Hospitality and Public Sector at Wipro to introduce this great panel. Over to you, Nitesh.
Am I audible, Georgina?
Yes,
Hello?
we can. I was on mute.
Thanks a lot, Georgina, and good morning to all of you. As I've already been introduced, I'll probably not spend time on that. So thank you very much, Tech UK, for such a fantastic event. It has certainly been a very enriching 2 days of listening and learning from various speakers and panelists. Yesterday, we heard from the minister and other senior officials from Home Office, DWP, and HMRC, and today as well from KT, Mark, and Matthew on how the entire government machinery, infrastructure, officials have stepped up to provide seamless services during this pandemic. And frankly, that was what was expected in the current times when virtual has become the reality and the digital has become the new physical in almost all aspects of life. Public services was supposed to be no exception, right? Consumers and citizens across all age groups have reoriented themselves and assimilated digital to more or less become digital natives. In that context, I think a smarter state post-COVID will be very different than what was probably envisaged pre-COVID. In a lot of ways, it has accelerated the journey to a smarter state. And we are looking at a remote touchless governance, and that's the very topic of this panel discussion. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers who will reflect on the future of transformation in government and the legacy of COVID-19 crisis in terms of procurement, innovation, and enabling role of technology. Without further ado, let me introduce the panelists to you. John, can I see you on the video, please? All right. Yeah.
Hi, Nitesh, I'm here.
John is a veteran of close to 30 years at the Highland Council, playing a variety of roles before moving into management role in the central ICT team about 10 years ago. He heads the ICT and digital transformation for Highlands Council, responsible for managing the partnership with Wipro as well. And most importantly, I think Highland Council, in this job, he provides ICT services to nearly 10,000 staff in over 450 locations to 207 schools, with over 30,000 pupils and supporting digital services provision to around 235,000 people. When he's not working, he is busy running, orienteering, mountaineering, cycling or skiing, and records all of them digitally wherever he can and uploads it to Strava. Next speaker we have lined up, Peter Tolland. Peter is the head of digital directorate programs at the Scottish Government. Peter leads the teams at the Scottish Government implementing the digital ecosystem, including the delivery of corporate digital services, platforms, and products. He's also the chair of the Once for Scotland Public Sector Collaboration Forum, the Scottish Government Platform Design Authority, and a member of National Data Delivery Group, and a committee member with SOCTEM as well. He is a lead assessor for Digital Scotland Service Standard, and Peter has extensive experience across the public, private, educational, and voluntary sectors, previously holding positions at North Lanarkshire Council, which is where he partnered with us, Stirling Council, Polaroid, Littlewoods, and Pilkington. Last but certainly not the least, we have Mark, strategic transformation, innovation, digital, and IT director with over 30 years of experience in public and private sector. Mark is currently a director at SOCTEM Advisory, an ICT and digital consultancy. Throughout his career, Mark has worked in a variety of roles in public and private sectors, including the role of CIO and CDIO at Essex, Buckinghamshire, and Suffolk councils, all with a focus on technology and digital strategy improvement, change management, and innovative transformation and modernization. He is a key influencer on related policies and thought leadership at national level. So I'm pretty sure we'll have a good panel discussion with such a distinguished panel. Let me kick it off, as the topic of this discussion is, what changes we have seen in terms of, remote governance, digital governance, touchless governance, if you will. So what kind of changes have you observed in how citizens are expecting and consuming public services? And has COVID brought new learnings in that context? So starting with you, Peter, if you can kick it off, please.
Hi, good morning. I think customers now have a much higher expectation of government and are holding us to higher standards. And we're now dealing with users of government services who are becoming more and more comfortable with online service provision. And they're expecting things to happen more quickly than they ever did. So they're expecting things to see and accelerate. They're also challenging us more. That's an interesting point, where I would say customers are expecting to operate within their own context. And by that, I mean, they're not overly interested in how government works as long as it delivers what they're requiring. And I think that's then putting an emphasis on government, if you like, through this change to cede more control, because we can't do everything ourselves. We're recognizing that. And so we're ceding that control to others to help us, and ultimately to our customers, which I think is quite uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. John, if we can hear from you as well.
Thanks, Nitesh. Peter, I would absolutely echo your thoughts with that. Not interested in how government works. Yeah, why should citizens be interested in which department is structured in which way, and which organisation should be providing the services that they require? No, I think one of our biggest challenges here is it's not technology. It's actually breaking down some of those barriers that we've built ourselves over decades and decades of organizational barriers which stop us providing what citizens require. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things for me this year, in all the terrible things that have been happening, we have made leaps forwards in our council of how our staff interact remotely, let alone citizens. And I think that has been a wake-up call to us as an organization that actually, you know, we're behind the times. Citizens expect more of us. They are ahead of us all the time in what they are demanding and the way we provide services. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. I think, you know, what we've leapt ahead with over the last 6 months is, I think, leading our staff, our leaders, and our politicians along that journey of understanding how we can do things better, and in some ways doing that as rapidly and as urgently we've had to do, I think has had a hugely beneficial effect to us as an organization. We can pick up on some of those points later, but you know, I just absolutely echo, you know, we're behind the times. We need to catch up. We need to join up, and we need to just move away from the fact that we're separate organizations across government, and deliver things in a joined up way.
Sure. And Mark, you have a broader view from from variety of people that you speak to, organization that you talk to. Your perspective on this topic, please.
Well, I think it's very interesting, isn't it, Nitesh? Because one of the things that we have been talking about in the digital space now for years and years is how we get people to adopt digital ways of thinking and digital ways of operating. And actually, what the COVID crisis and the lockdown caused was a change in the way society worked. And actually, some of the things that were available to people to do were suddenly taken away from them, one of which was human interaction and human contact. And actually, what that did is it changed the way that many people interacted with their computers and with digital technologies. And I kind of refer to it slightly, one of these new nuanced phrases of digital by necessity. And what does that really mean? So in a lot of cases, you know, we were required as society to interact with digital to get things done that we may have done differently in the past. So I think that was a great question of pushing people over into a familiarity with digital technologies and digital ways of doing things. I think the question which will always be one that time will tell is how much longevity that will have in society as we move forward. Of course, as digital leaders, we would like to think that that's going to become a norm. But of course, there will be a rebalancing at some point. You know, human beings do crave interaction and contact, particularly those that suffer deprivation or isolation in the way that they live and they operate. So there's going to be a natural rebalancing. I think the interesting thing for both government and for society in general is how do we get that balance to sit at a place where we're happy that it has advanced significantly and is holding its own in that digital paradigm, as opposed to going too far back. And I think getting things right, continuing with the good things, working on things that haven't been quite so good and pushing them forward without sort of letting them go and moving back to the past, will allow us to stabilize that position and make us far more of a digitally enabled and digitally willing set of countries than maybe we were before COVID started.
In fact, Mark, you bring a very valid point. In fact, we probably are in a transition phase of a change journey, not knowing what the final destination is. And it brings a fundamental question: are these changes in behavior here to stay, or once this crisis is beyond us, both the citizens as well as public services executive will go back to old ways? In some fashion, you're saying it'll be somewhere in between, but it'll be good to hear if you can continue your thought process on what do you think the final destination is and what the world is going to look like in terms of this behavior and the change adoption.
I think from what we're seeing, the reality is nobody is seeing us going back to the old ways. That's one of those questions that's out there. Will people drop back into the ways they were before? And I don't think so. There's no indicators to suggest that will happen. We listen to the rhetoric that's going around between people, between organisations and within government. And clearly what there is a recalibration of the reality. I'm trying to move it away from new normal, but a recalibration of the reality. We see people discussing things that maybe haven't been on the agenda for a little while: estates rationalisation and estates management. What buildings will we need? How will people occupy space? How will people come in to talk to us in that space that they then occupy in a future state? And I think those are going to rumble on. We see, the proliferation of recovery teams within councils and in other areas, looking at what now needs to happen, rebalancing the needs of a council to provide services and guidance to many areas of society, from the economics right the way through to the social deprivation. How do you get that right within the context of being a council? I think what we recognise is that there has been a shift, a definitive shift in the way we think about things and the way we interact. And that shift will have grip, as you say, the existence of how far that grip goes. I think to a certain extent is in the eye of the beholder and for individuals to define, but also for those in positions of leadership and power to push the button forward, to make that advocacy of doing things in a digital way just far more appealing to people to continue with, rather than drop back into some of those more familiar, more traditional ways of doing things.
Sure. And for all the audience, please do post your questions in the chat. If time permits, I'll certainly make sure that the panel gets to discuss that as well. John, in the context of Highland Council, and you're seeing it probably firsthand, what's your observation in terms of, is this change, is this transition going to be successful to a permanent something new, or will people resort to old ways? And are you seeing signs of that?
I think there's a real commitment from our leadership to not just go back to the old ways, but I think more importantly, a lot of our staff are saying, actually, this fits better with my work-life balance. We're a huge area with 25,000 square kilometers. In times of difficult budgets, it is a very challenging task to provide services to such a remote and large area. I think if we look at some of the interesting trends that I've seen in the Highlands, we've worked in two different directions. In one direction, clearly, we have been using technology like Zoom, like Teams. We've been working in an environment where we could be next door to each other, but we're hundreds of kilometers away from each other. At the same time, we've actually seen a bit of a resurgence in some of our very local services and activities. So we're seeing some of our tiny local shops doing better than they've ever done before. We're seeing local farmers setting up farm shops and serving a very local community need. And I think that's something as a council we need to be looking at everything else that's happening around us and looking at how people are changing their behaviours. And I really hope that some of those behaviours around keeping things local, but at the same time being connected in a much more wide sense, I really hope they continue. And I think we've got a challenge there to step up to the mark and support that way of the citizens are behaving, because we're all citizens. I mean, you know, I've changed the way I behave this year, and I think that's a learning point for us. And that yes, we're not going to go right back to where we were. Absolutely, we're not. But how do we actually take it the next step, and how do we make it sustainable, and how do we really embed that change and take it away from something that was done through necessity into something that actually is the way we all want to live and the way we want to work.
Yeah, and Peter, at the larger Scotland level, you know, are there any differing point of view? Would you agree with what John and Mark have commented?
Oh, I completely agree with both what Mark and John have been saying. I think when COVID hit, my world, if I talk about me personally, my world got very small. I mean, it became very small because I realized that something that happened halfway around the world was now impacting my life dramatically. And that does change your perspective, that you can't help doing that. And I've also come to the realization that we're now in a world where COVID-19 can happen. So if COVID-19 can happen, so can other things. So we're now in a world where these kind of events may actually become more common. I'm not wishing them on anyone, but they could become more common. And I think for government, that has brought this change of perspective. It was a bit like John was mentioning about local shops and things. We're now living in a physical, sort of local physical setting, but with a virtual global dimension that allows that to happen. So if we are talking about government here, we're looking at the wider mission now. We're looking not just at government providing its own services, what it's needing to do, but its role in the wider, in supporting wider society. And that might be at a UK level, it might be at a global level, because we're now realizing we have commitments in what we have to do. And again, that touches back onto this idea of collaboration and not being able to do everything yourself. We need to be in a collaborative world now. And you, Nitesh, you mentioned I chair Once for Scotland. Well, it's bringing together 100+ organisations to try and align and bring a common working practice to the way we do things. And that we've never really tried it in that scale before, but we're building that into the digital strategy to underpin it. And that came from very simple realizations. When COVID hit, I was told to work from home. I was stuck in my dining room, and then all sorts of things happened that we had to. I was fully involved in the Scottish efforts for the volunteering services and bringing volunteers in. And then you realised, how do you reach the person who reaches the person who contacts the person that makes all of this happen? And not to just use brand names here, but I found myself on LinkedIn hunting people down in the Red Cross. And this is a true story. So I could identify people in the British Red Cross that I could speak to. And we've realised that's not the way ahead. So if you take Once for Scotland, we've now decided to underpin that kind of working group with a corporate knowledge repository that's going to make it easier for us to find that information. Now, that's a fundamental step change in the way government normally works. And so we're going to do that, and we're committing to it in the digital strategy. So it has changed. Its perspectives have definitely changed.
So I think, Peter, I'll just probably follow on the same topic, because you touched upon digital strategy and ultimately, all of us, though, pre-COVID, were still inundated with complex systems. This entire new ways of working and the change in paradigm. We all accepting that this change is here to stay in some form and shape. What kind of digital or technology initiatives are we seeing or expected to see as a result of this new paradigm? And what happens to all this old legacy system and complex system, the way they have been built? What kind of initiatives are we seeing on the ground or expected to see going forward? Peter, maybe you can continue and then we'll take over to Mark and then John as well.
I think for me, we're seeing the speeding up of the new technologies. So for me, the big one that's standing out here is AI. I mean, it's come to the fore in a way that I wouldn't have expected as quickly as I would have expected. And I think very many people are underappreciating AI in terms of the impact it's going to have and the amount of heavy lifting that's going to be used to deliver services. And I think it's going to become something that's part of almost everything. And we're certainly moving in that direction. But it's also a link. I jumped into the previous discussions in the other workshop where they were talking about data. And AI really needs data. So there's a further discussion here about how we would use AI, how we would use data to make all this happen. And I'm one of these advocates that say that people should control their own data. And again, that's a fundamental shift. So previous speakers were talking about this, but this is about only bringing in the data you need. You should never, if you're providing a service, I suppose, ask for any data that you can auto-detect, copy or deduce from what you've already got. I mean, why would you want to do that? And AI lends itself to that in a wonderful way. And again, we need to think about how we're storing it, what we're using it. Things should be stored where they sit. And the whole purpose of that is to get away from just it being technology, is that I'm not really just fundamentally talking about AI and data. I'm talking about what it really brings, which I suppose to some extent is the ability to make better decisions, to make them faster, and actually make decisions about more important things. Because I think sometimes we're just making decisions on things that in retrospect weren't that important at all. Sure.
Mark, you probably challenged, advised, and consulted or counseled many executives who are probably making that decision or looking at changing their digital strategy. So why don't you offer your perspective in terms of what are we going to expect? Mark, you're on mute.
There we go. Yes. Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Peter said there. I think I would also have started at the data layer, but I'll offer up a quote which I really like, which I think sort of frames where we go going forward. And that's, don't find customers for your products, find products for your customers. And actually, I think that is an ethic that we need to take forward as we move on. We need to start considering what services and what products are going to be built that actually add real value in the broader sense to our society and what we do in government. And I think government can be accused a little bit in the past of finding ways to put wheels on its own services in the way that they were. And that's why digital has been such a challenge for all of us over time, to change that thinking, change those processes and get people thinking a different way. But actually across COVID, people have started thinking a different way. They've been able to lighten the load. They've been able to push things out much more quickly. You know, I'm hearing people using parts of their own solutions to create parking systems, to create booking systems for waste sites, you know, things that they said were temporary fixes that were not going to be designed for the long term, but have suddenly hit such a true vein of positivity across people that actually they're now almost busting at the seams, and they were so obvious and so simple because our world has changed. Being able to move freely around is just not the way we operate at the moment. Pre-booking is king. You know, you have to work out where you're going to go and when you're going to go. So actually, very simple solutions. I think if we think too deeply about it and go too far, then we've got it wrong. The simple things will gain traction and will be done quickly. The principles of digital, which is build, increment, grow, I think this is what we will see. The ones that will work are the ones that are simple. And I hate to pick on the government here on the track and trace app, but it's always been a mantra, has it not, that you under promise and over deliver. I think it's a mantra that's sat in IT for a long time. Test, track and trace. Not sure that necessarily fits the sniff test on that particular one. But actually, that's what we need to do. We need to get things right. We need to build the trust, and we need to build the advocacy of the people that are using them. And they will tell us the things that work. They will tell us the things that are here to stay because they'll use them. They'll tell us they like them. So I don't think big bang is the answer. I think small increment, do the things people want, and then people will start to use and continue to use digital.
Sure. So basically keep citizens at the heart of everything. Simplicity, agility, that's what you're advocating in terms of
Yeah.
Okay, John, are you thinking along the same lines in the Highland Council, because you are the one making those choices, if I'm not wrong, for council?
We're in danger of violent agreement throughout all of this. Yeah, just picking up on Mark's point there. I absolutely. I've written down in my notes here. What we don't need right now is big long-term IT projects. What we need is building on small-scale successes and building that confidence and starting to show that we can deliver things in a different way and that we can meet expectations. And if we think about the sort of services that that we've been providing over the last 6 months, that where we've seen a complete shift in how they're delivered, and some of that is services for those people who here's where I think we've been getting it wrong. We've as a council assumed that because we have a lot of vulnerable people who maybe don't have the connectivity, don't have the ability to use technology to interact with us remotely, we've focused a lot of attention, quite rightly, on how we deliver services to those people. And so the example we've got is that we've got service points, one-stop shops all around the Highlands. They've been a political football, let's say, for years, because they're expensive places to run. And in some of our remote communities, they're very difficult to keep going, because it's staffing that 7 days, well, even 3 or 4 days a week can be really difficult. And they're an easy thing, a target for cutting. But the focus is very much on, we've got to provide services locally. We've got to support those people who cannot interact with us through digital technology. Overnight, all of those places shut back in March. Now, our stats for getting welfare payments, benefits out to people, dealing with queries, dealing with problems around benefits, our performance has increased massively over the last few months. We've got payments out to people more quickly. We've dealt with queries more quickly, and we are having less complaints. And this is some of our most vulnerable people we're talking about here. We've put in place within a week a helpline with and drafted staff in from completely different parts of the council to assist in that helpline, working from home. So we've, and that's turned our thinking upside down. That was exactly the sort of service we thought had to be face-to-face for a lot of people. And there's still a need for face-to-face for some people, absolutely. But what we are doing is that we're taking a lot of that grunt work, a lot of that process work. We're not necessarily automating things at this point, but we're just making it easier for our staff to do their job more effectively. That gives us more time to spend with the people who really need our face-to-face help. But even that face-to-face, for a lot of these people, because they've been shielding, because they're very vulnerable, we haven't been able to do face-to-face. So we have put out technology to them, and we've helped them through that. And so we've been doing video consultations with people. And these are people that actually we always assumed, quite wrongly, that wouldn't be able to interact with us in that way. I think it's been an eye-opener for us that we can do some of these basic things far better. And Peter, AI and new technology, yes, I agree. That's something that can really assist us. But actually, for the people on the ground, it's some pretty basic stuff that is making a difference for them. And it's some stuff, it's the use of, our adoption of Microsoft Teams, for instance, product, it went from 0 to all our staff and all our elected members within 3 weeks.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a pretty basic thing.
Yeah, no, in fact, John, well, in fact, I wanted to probably go into the other two panelists and ask their point of view. Are there specific kind of services or specific department, both at the federal level, central level, as well as at the local level, which you think are going to be more prone to this remote and touchless governance? Any advice that you would want to give to some of those who should take a leap of faith and be the be the front runner, if you will? So, Mark, from your perspective, what departments, which kind of services would you say should be leading this way for us?
I think it's an interesting question, and of course, there are certain services that councils provide that by their very nature need to have human interaction, from the very basic infrastructure type things where you need to be out there looking after physical entities, and those areas where I guess human and physical interaction in the longer term are vital to the delivery of those services, thinking more in your sort of social care sort of spaces. But actually, I would contend that everybody should be a front runner. There's nothing that's holding anybody back at this point from being the evangelist around taking their digital services forward. Whatever part that you work in a council, whether you're in legal, whether you're in certain parts of IT, whether you're in policy and performance areas, everybody has an equal opportunity to take this forward. The principles that have been created and pushed forward as a part of lockdown are principles that were there before. Maybe people didn't quite see them, didn't feel them, weren't quite as comfortable with them, but actually through necessity, they've now become more comfortable with them. And actually continuing that journey is really, really important. And I actually feel that when we get to a point where we have that genuine personal choice within the framework that we operate, which obviously we recognise right now is slightly unusual, having that framework choice, if we're doing things right and we're getting the digital journeys correct, then the advocacy will follow the right channels.
Sure. Peter?
I take on board what John and Mark are saying there, and John particularly was talking about things being turned on their head. And I think this has surprised me, certainly in some of the services that we thought would be difficult to provide online. And that's now shown to be different to the way we imagined it in the beginning. And I think if we're looking at services here, then I would say it's down to our imagination and ingenuity. We could probably tackle any service. There shouldn't be any, we shouldn't instantly think of any no-go areas. I think we should be exploring them all. Because I think the one thing that stood out for me here is that this idea of remote service provision is a funny concept. Because I think going into COVID, I would always imagine remote as the actual definition of the word. It's remote, but in actually many ways it's bringing you closer to your customer because it's giving you more opportunities to do that. So I agree with both Mark and John. Yeah.
Yeah. See, in fact, since we're talking about this topic where simple new practices, new initiatives, if you will, one of the point I wanted to bring to your attention and seek your views is what are we seeing and what are we learning from some of the other governments across the world or some of the other countries across the world? And we've seen, all of us probably have read about Estonia and their initiative called e-Estonia, which is a movement by the government to facilitate citizen interaction with the state through the use of electronic solutions. We're talking about 600 e-services to its citizen, 2,400 to businesses, right? Taxes is take less than an hour to file. And if you look at their X-Road initiative, which is a secure national data exchange platform, the other panel was talking about how data needs to be shared and exchanged. Or if you look at Name ID, which is the Denmark's digital signature initiative. What are some of the learnings we're going to incorporate? Are you seeing signs where in the UK government We are incorporating those best practices, initiating new strategies which are learning from them. And what else would you advise to various audience here? Maybe we can start with Mark this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting, isn't it? We've the UK government has had aspirations and strategies around doing many of those, if not more, sort of initiatives over time. And I think they floundered a little bit around the common aspects and the common problems. One being data, and particularly around confidence and credibility of the handling, use and storage of data, which we touched upon slightly earlier when Peter was talking about that. People therefore lose confidence. And I think there are as many aspirations in UK government as we're seeing elsewhere. The question has to be what breaks that down. I've been involved in many government initiatives from part of a local authority point of view, as a test case, a pilot, an alpha, a beta, all of those things. And very rarely do those things come to the fore as being finalised products. And I think that's probably been the challenge over the years. And I think that's probably sat back in that old definition and view about what has held digital back, in fact, over the years. And I think what we need to do is bring the learning forward that we've had over the last few months and try and take this in bite-sized chunks, rather than try and create enormous platforms that are going to do this, that, and the other. And of course, they take a lot of money and a lot of time and then are fraught with difficulty, and the whole thing shuts down. We've talked here about incremental growth and development. Think long term, small increment, small increment, small increment. I think actually from all of those things, from a single record that you could carry around on an app right the way through to a huge government ID gateway, all of those things should be built incrementally. Build the confidence. Get your data ethics and federacy right. Make sure people are going to want them. Back to my quote, do they want what you're building, or are you building it for a reason nobody understood? Right, and if you get those things right and you take them forward in the right way and in the right mechanism and routine, then there's no reason we can't be doing those things and more. That certainly we don't have a problem with ideas generation in the UK around the things that we could do. That's absolutely not the case. However, we may sort of flounder a little bit at times with trying to bite too much off in one go and therefore not succeed.
Sure. I'll come back to you, Mark, on this, because when you start to build in small increments without having the larger overall view of the puzzle, if you will, the pieces may not fit in. But hang on there, Peter. I want to hear from you in your perspective on this, and specifically, what are you thinking in context of Scotland?
It's funny you're saying you're going to get back to Mark, because I'm a big fan of incremental change. So that'll be an interest to hear that further explode. I mean, we're currently in discussion with many of the countries you were talking about there, Estonia and New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Denmark. We're out there seeking new ways of doing things all the time. It's what we do. But the interesting thing is it's very rarely lift and shift. So no one's going out there to lift the Estonia model and bring it here and just dump it down and turn it on. That's not going to happen. What we're seeking is common themes. And interestingly, the common themes you find are the things you already know. And so sometimes you just feel that you're in a Groundhog Day moment where, well, if you're in Estonia and they tell you, focus on user-centered design, keep your customer at the heart of things, work it out. It's a bit like Mark was saying about build the products they need. I mean, they're telling you all the things you already know. And then I look at the Scottish Government, and we've got the Scottish approach to service design. The UK government's got their own approach to service design. Everybody's got their approach to service design. Then you go into the various places and say, are you using it? Are you following it? And it's very hit and miss. And I think what we need to do is we need to get better at understanding the tools, understanding the approaches, understanding what other countries globally have done to get them on the journey, to take them there. And then we can align and start working in a similar way. And then it will make it easier to bring and use and reuse the smaller bits and pieces that we can build from in our own sort of ecosystems.
Sure. John, your perspective before I get back to Mark.
Well, I guess, I mean, there's no way that the UK is ever going to be Estonia. We haven't we haven't come out of the Soviet bloc. We're not in that almost kind of need to start from the ground up. Sometimes you wish actually you did have that ability, but we don't. As I said earlier, I fully agree with this approach of incremental change and building things up rather than going into monolithic long-term IT projects that go over budget and over time and don't deliver. But I think there's another part of me that says actually we need to get to grips with what things we just have to mandate to public sector organizations. So take authentication as one example. Yes, we can all build up gradually, put in our own authentication platforms, which is all very well, but it needs to be heading towards a common end goal. As far as I'm concerned. There needs to be, a vision for and an acceptance that sort of digital signature e-identity is a good thing for the country to have, and that we are heading towards a single identity for a citizen. You can build that up bit by bit, but you've got to do it in a way that it can head to that vision. And I think that's one of the lessons that I get from some of these the countries that we're talking about is that there is a benefit from doing that, and actually there's a lot of acceptance from the citizens in those countries that that's a good thing.
Yeah, in fact, that's the exact point, Mark, I was coming to. John just hit it on the so the point is, how do you make sure that you have the larger blueprint or end destination visible so that what the building doesn't end up becoming a small incremental silo, right? So at some point in time, you have to have that balance of building in small bite-sized chunk, but obviously having the visibility of what you're heading towards at a larger cost.
Yeah, and I think it's been a challenge, hasn't it, for the UK government for some time, which is setting a goal and a vision and a strategy and sticking to it. And that's part of the problem with why we don't get to places, because things change, administrations change, points of view change, and suddenly the end goal keeps changing. And I've been involved, as I'm sure my colleagues have, with many initiatives which started off square and then went circular, then went oval. By the time you'd finished it, it was triangular and it had stopped. We need to stop doing that. I think John's right. We understand the things that just need to be done, things that are right, and that singularity of purpose and putting that in a strategy, it's the right thing to do. We've got to get it right and do it in the right way. We've got to get our data ethics right. We've got to get the practicalities right. And that's where I think the kind of incremental change in getting people comfortable with it is important. But I think what we need to do is have that singularity of purpose of knowing where we're going and sticking to it without keep changing it, because it's the circuitous route to get to the end product that will kill us. I mean, as I often refer to, it's agile done in a waterfall way. It doesn't work. Things have to exist within the logic. And actually, if we think they're the right things to do, and people haven't really changed actually that much over the last few years in what are the right things to do, we need to work more on getting it done right, keeping that purpose together and rolling and evolving and doing it that way.
Now, I may want to pick up this one question that just popped up in chat because it probably lines up very well to the point that you just now made. Question is from Chris, who's asking, will it be my identity or government's? In other words, can this be done by consent and convenience rather than mandate? So John, you touched upon this topic of national identity or one single authentication, if you will. In context of this question, would you like to share your perspective?
It's always going to be an individual's identity. I think and there has to be consent built up through people's confidence in the way we handle data, the way we deal with privacy, the way we provide services in a secure way. So I think it's actually both. I mean, there has to be a mandate, as we were just hearing about, that we're all heading in the same direction. But unless citizens are consenting to that approach, it's not going to work. Now, we've seen that sort of thing in the past, certainly in Scotland here. We saw big backlash about identity cards some years ago, and how that all got tied up with initiatives around citizens' account, my account, and I think it can really put things backwards if we don't get that buy-in from the people that are going to be getting the services from us. At the same time, we need to have a clear direction of where we're going.
I think Peter will be in a good position to share his perspective on where this is headed in his role. Obviously,
Yes.
we also heard government as a platform initiative. So Peter, it will be good to hear your perspective on this very fundamental.
I think to answer the question, my straight answer there would be that the identity is owned and it's the individuals. I mean, it's theirs. I go further to say that the data we're using to provide the services is also theirs. And that would be a sensible direction of travel. And I think we need to then build from that kind of understanding and take things forward. I mean, I joined the government, and one of the points when I joined the government was to introduce this idea of platforms for governments and citizens. So this is this idea that the government would be running on platforms. But the interesting thing was when I set up the Platform Design Authority, the first thing we spent ages arguing about was what is a platform? And you think to yourself, okay, that's useful. But it was very useful because what we've ended up thinking about is that platforms are four layers, if you like. So, and then we've touched on this already, but at the bottom, you've got the data layer, then you've got the infrastructure layer, which is the tech, and then you've actually got the service or product layer, the community kind of layer that sits on top of that. And then you're encapsulating all of that in a network effect. I'm not going to go there, but it's so that you can then derive value from the three layers. And we are now using that across Scottish Government as a communication tool so that we're speaking to people and we're saying, because someone will turn around and say, I'm building a platform. So, I mean, we have payments platforms, identity platforms, publishing, cloud, data, performance, there's all these platforms. And people will be heading that program and saying, well, I'm building a publishing platform. But for me, if you don't have data, you don't have infrastructure, and you don't have, say, a community or a service provision, you're not really building a platform. I mean, I don't think anyone in this discussion would think that Airbnb, for example, was very good if they had no databases of accommodation. I mean, you could go into the platform, but what are you going to do? Same thing happens with Uber if they don't have any vehicles in their databases. But we still have people building platforms with no databases underneath them and thinking that they're going to achieve something. And they probably will achieve something, but they're not going to achieve what you're actually anticipating. So if I took this as an example, I talked about Once for Scotland. Once for Scotland, we're looking at 100 plus central government organisations coming together. And if I was going to be brutal, it's a talking shop. We've got a bunch of people together and we talk about alignment, we talk about collaborating, we talk about doing things once, and it's all very useful. There's no infrastructure layer. There's no data layer. We're just sitting there talking. So what we've agreed is, I mentioned this briefly, what we've agreed is to build the corporate knowledge repository, which is going to be our infrastructure layer. So all of those organizations are now coming together and saying, look, if we could build an open, and we're looking at having it open so other organizations can use it, where you can come in and you can actually connect with people who are already doing things like licensing platforms, CRM platforms, cloud stuff, migration, and put you in touch with them, that would be really useful. And that's come out of COVID. And so underpinning that, you'll probably find you've got case study databases, digital asset databases, and all of these things will be held by the people who have them. But you can then see that that entire platform, if you call that a collaboration platform, then it's got the Once for Scotland community at the top, it's got the infrastructure layer, the corporate knowledge repository, and then it's got the databases. And it actually makes sense. So we're using this as a training exercise across government. so that people understand how it works.
Thank you. And I think we are almost at the top of the our time. I want to thank you all the panelists and all the audience as well. John, in quick 20 seconds, if there's one question specifically to you, what was the biggest change driver when COVID hit for you? Was it technology, teams, or was it change in your thinking? If you can answer that question, but before that, I want to thank you, the panel, and then hand it back to Georgina just before, after John answers the question. John.
Okay, thanks, Nitesh. I think it's actually picked up in one of the other points that's been made. It's about urgency. The biggest change for us, it wasn't about technology, it was about an urgency to do something. And our senior leadership team basically looking at me saying, you've got to do this in a week. Now that doesn't usually happen in an IT project. In an IT project, we're talking about much longer timescales. And I think the big question for me going forward, how do we keep that urgency there? Because that was the really big thing. We didn't have to spend a lot of money to make this happen, to get our staff working remotely. Cost wasn't the driver here. It was the urgency to do something immediately, and focusing that leadership on, right, you've got to make a decision today to make that happen next week. And that's what I want to see going forward.
Thank you very much. And thanks, the panelists. Georgina, over to you.